Imagine a darkness so absolute that it ceases to be the mere absence of light and becomes a physical weight pressing against your chest. Your chest rises and falls, scraping against cold, weeping limestone. The air you breathe does not feel like air. It feels like the damp, recycled breath of 50 men who died in this exact space before your grandfather was even born. You cannot stretch your legs. If you move your left foot 3 inches to the side, it sinks into a soft, gelatinous mass that your mind desperately tries to convince you is just wet mud. It is not mud. You are currently occupying the lowest tier of human existence. You are inside the belly of an engine designed to do one thing: grind your identity, your history, and your sanity into fine, unrecognizable dust. Most people look at the towering stone battlements of a medieval castle and see majesty. They see knights, banners, and the romantic theater of ancient kingship. They do not look at the ground beneath the flagstones. They do not see the vertical shafts drilled deep into the bedrock. They do not see the thousands of human beings who spent their youth staring upward at a tiny, iron-barred square of gray sky, waiting for a trial that the legal system had already forgotten to schedule. This is not a story about ghosts. Ghosts are a luxury of the imagination. Ghosts mean that the suffering has ended and only the memory remains. This is a story about the machinery of living flesh. It is about an era where the law did not lock you away to pay your debt to society. The law locked you away because your living body was the most valuable collateral your family owned. Stay where you are. Listen to the dripping water. Do not look away from the dark. Because over the next 6 chapters, we are going to dismantle the stone walls of the medieval dungeon, brick by bloody brick, to understand exactly how the human mind behaves when it is systematically erased from the face of the earth. The transition from a citizen to a non-person happens in the space of a single heartbeat. One afternoon, you are walking through a crowded market square, your boots kicking up the dry summer dust. The next morning, you are dropping through a hole in the floor. The heavy oak trapdoor slams shut above you with a sound that resembles a thunderclap. The iron bolt slides into place. That sound, the dry, metallic clack of iron meeting iron, is the last meaningful communication you will ever receive from the world of the living. Your eyes do not adjust to the dark because there is no light to adjust to. There are no torches here. Fire requires oxygen, and oxygen is a resource the castle prefers to save for the great hall 3 floors above your head. The only illumination is a pathetic, sickly gray square that hovers 15 feet directly above you. It is the size of a handkerchief. If a guard stands over the grate, the square disappears entirely, and you are plunged into an environment that is biologically hostile to human eyes. The architecture itself is a form of physical violence. This is a cell designed by men who understood that space is a luxury. The walls do not meet at clean 90-degree angles. They curve inward, forcing your body into a permanent, unnatural crouch. You cannot stand up straight. The ceiling is barely 5 feet high. You cannot lie down flat. The floor is a narrow wedge of jagged stone, slick with a greasy film of condensation and human waste. If you attempt to sit, your knees press tightly against your chin. Your spine is forced into a continuous, agonizing arc. Within 48 hours, the muscles along your lower back will begin to spasm, hardening into tight knots of pain that never ease. Then come the inhabitants of the floor. You feel them before you see them. A light, scratchy movement across the top of your bare foot. A sudden, sharp prick on your ankle. The rats in these lower chambers do not fear humans. To them, a human being who does not move is simply a large, slow-moving deposit of protein. They will test your skin while you are awake. They will bite at the soft tissue around your cuticles and your eyelids while you sleep. If you scream, the sound simply bounces off the wet limestone and returns to your own ears, slightly muffled, as if the castle itself is mocking your terror. You are entirely alone, yet you are surrounded by the remnants of those who came before. As your fingers trace the rough surface of the wall, searching for any leverage to ease the pressure on your spine, you feel it. Grooves. Deep, ragged ruts carved into the stone. Some are short, some are long. You count them by touch. 12, 24, 36. Then, the grooves stop. Your hand slides downward and encounters something different. A pile of dry, brittle sticks that crush under your fingers like old twig. Except they aren't twigs. They are the ribs of the last tenant. The jailer did not clean the cell before throwing you down. Why would he? In the economy of the dungeon, an empty cell is lost revenue. A corpse is simply furniture. You are 24 years old. Your crime was not treason. You did not plot to poison the well or assassinate the local magistrate. You merely signed a contract for grain that you could not honor after the winter frost destroyed your crop. But in the eyes of the law, an unpaid debt is a physical theft from the nobility, and the nobility does not forgive a theft of its luxury. You have been cast into the oubliette, the place of forgetting. Upstairs, in the warm, wood-paneled chambers of the scriptorium, a clerk is currently drawing a single, horizontal ink line through your name in the parish register. You are not dead yet, but for all practical purposes, your existence has been cancelled. Stay with us till the end for valuable insight. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. The second thing the darkness teaches you is that everything has a price, and the price of survival increases every time the sun goes down. Most people believe that once the heavy iron door locks you inside a castle dungeon, your relationship with money is over. They assume that because you are a prisoner, the state or the lord of the land assumes the burden of your physical existence. This is the great myth of the medieval dungeon. The castle was not a public institution. It was a private enterprise. The cells beneath the flagstones were operated like a twisted version of a modern hotel, where the guests were brought in by force and could never check out, but were still expected to pay for every single breath they took. The moment your feet touched the wet stone floor, you became a revenue stream for a man who viewed your slow physical decay as a standard business transaction. That man is the jailer. He does not wear a uniform. He does not have a salary. He bought his position from the local baron, or he inherited the key ring from his father like a butcher inherits a shop or a blacksmith inherits an anvil. He pays the lord a fixed annual rent for the right to manage the human filth of the county. Everything he extracts above that rent is his pure profit. Therefore, his entire lifestyle, the meat on his table, the wool coat on his back, the education of his children, depends completely on how efficiently he can squeeze coin out of the desperate people trapped in his pit. Let us look at the cold reality of a medieval winter. The temperature inside a subterranean stone cell drops to a point where the moisture in the air freezes directly onto the walls, forming long, weeping needles of ice. Your breath comes out in thick, white plumes. Your fingers lose all sensation within the first 3 hours. Your toes turn a dull, bruised purple inside your leather shoes. You look toward the heavy oak door. On the other side sits the jailer, warming his hands over a brazier of glowing charcoal. He has a stack of dry wheat straw and a pile of coarse wool blankets. He will not give them to you. If you want a pallet of clean straw to keep your kidneys from freezing against the bare stone, it will cost you 3 iron farthings a week. If you want a blanket that has not been soaked in the blood of a typhus victim, that is another 4 farthings. If you cannot pay, you sleep on the bare, wet rock. You watch the straw being carried past your iron grate to the cell of a wealthier merchant who committed the exact same crime as you, but whose family can afford the luxury tier of the dungeon. The monetization of your misery does not stop at bedding. It extends to the very air you breathe and the light you are denied. If you want a single tallow candle stub so you can see the rats before they bite your face, the jailer will sell it to you at 4 times the market price in the town square. If you want to be moved from the lower, flooded pit to an upper room with a narrow slit of a window where you can occasionally see a blade of grass, you must pay the Concordia, a heavy relocation fee. In this space, your poverty is a capital offense. The system is designed to strip away your resources until you have nothing left but your bare flesh. And once your money runs out, the jailer's attitude toward you shifts from predatory hospitality to absolute indifference. To him, an inmate who cannot pay for his straw is an inefficient use of space. You are occupying a corner that could be rented to a profitable prisoner. You are consuming oxygen that costs him nothing, but yields him no return. The cold is not an accident of the weather. It is the jailer's primary sales assistant. It is the tool he uses to break your pride until you write a letter to your aging mother, begging her to sell her last milk cow just so you can buy 7 nights of dry bedding and a handful of wood shavings to keep your feet from rotting off your ankles. The human mind always looks for a bottom. When you are thrown into the dark, you tell yourself that things cannot possibly get worse than the cold stone and the frozen straw. You believe that because you have already lost your freedom, your home, and your dignity, you have nothing left for the world to take. But you are wrong. The dungeon always finds another layer. The moment the jailer realizes that your direct funds are exhausted, he introduces you to the concept of garnish. In the lexicon of medieval incarceration, garnish was not a decorative element on a food plate. It was a formal, institutionalized protection racket. It was a tax on your skin. The word itself comes from an old legal euphemism for furnishing or custom, but inside the cells it meant only one thing. You paid the jailer for the privilege of not being actively tortured by the environment or by the people around you. When a new prisoner enters an established communal cell, they are not entering a fellowship of the miserable. They are entering a microeconomy of survival. The old inmates, men who have already been broken by months of starvation, whose skin is gray from scurvy and whose minds are warped by the constant dark, turn their eyes toward you. They do not see a brother in suffering. They see a target. They see a way to lower their own bills. The jailer stands at the door, his heavy iron keys jingling against his leather belt. He looks at the senior prisoners and nods. This nod is a license. If you cannot pay the jailer your entry garnish, the foliage or the shackle money, the jailer simply steps back and turns his back to the iron bars. He does not intervene. In fact, he encourages what happens next. The older prisoners surround you. They demand your clothes. If your family cannot send silver pennies to the jailer's ledger, your wool tunic, your leather shoes, and even your linen undergarments are stripped from your body by force. These items are handed over to the jailer, who credits them against the debts of the stronger inmates or sells them back into the town market. If you resist, you are beaten. You are held down against the damp stones while men with broken teeth and infected fingernails punch you in the ribs until you hear the bones snap. The jailer watches this happen with the cold detachment of a farmer watching cattle compete for grain in a winter pen. To him, this violence is a structural necessity. It keeps the inmates divided. It ensures that the prisoners are too busy fighting each other for survival to ever look at the key ring on his belt and realize they outnumber him 10-1. The protection racket is absolute. If you want the guards to ignore your corner of the cell during the nightly shakedowns, you pay Garnish. If you want the heavy iron fetters around your ankles to be oiled so they do not eat through the flesh of your Achilles tendon and cause gangrene, you pay the easement of iron's fee. If you cannot pay, the jailer will intentionally select the rusted, jagged shackles that are 2 sizes too small for your frame. He will hammer the iron pins into place with a mallet, ensuring that every step you take scrapes a millimeter of skin from your bone. In this space, the concept of justice does not exist. The law that put you here is hundreds of miles away, written on sheepskin parchment in a well-lit courtroom. Down here, the only law is the ledger. Your survival is entirely dependent on your ability to remain a profitable asset to the man who holds the key. The moment you become a financial dead end, the machinery of the dungeon begins to compress, squeezing you between the cruelty of the jailer and the desperation of your fellow captives until there is nothing left of you but a name on a piece of scrap paper that the jailer will burn the moment your body stops breathing. There is a specific moment when a prisoner stops looking up at the ceiling. For the first few weeks, your eyes are drawn magnetically to the light. No matter how dim, how gray, or how fleeting that tiny square of sky is, your neck remains tilted back. You watch the dust motes dance in the solitary sunbeam. You wait for the shadow of a bird to cross the iron grate. But by the 3rd month, your neck gets tired. The muscles stiffen. You realize that the light is not an escape hatch. It is a taunt. It is there to remind you that a world still exists where men walk horizontally without hitting stone. That is when you truly enter the oubliette. The word itself does not describe a physical structure. It describes a psychological objective. It comes from the French oublier, to forget. The men who engineered these shafts did not build them to hold bodies. They built them to dissolve identities. They understood that if you isolate a human being completely from the sights, sounds, and rhythms of human society, the mind will eventually turn inward and begin to devour itself. Let us look at the design of the standard castle bottle dungeon. It is a vertical stone cylinder, wide at the base and narrow at the top, like the neck of a flask. There are no stairs. There are no ladders. You do not walk into an oubliette. You are poured into it. The guards attach a hemp rope under your armpits, lift you off your feet, and lower you down into the dark. When your boots touch the floor, they untie the knot, pull the rope back up, and slide the oak cover over the hole. The silence that follows is absolute. It is not the quiet of a midnight field. It is the dead, heavy silence of a tomb. You can hear the internal mechanics of your own body with terrifying clarity. You hear the wet, rhythmic thumping of your own heart. You hear the click of your jaw when you swallow. You hear the high-pitched, metallic ringing in your ears that your brain manufactures out of nothing because it is starved for sensory input. But there was a variation of this cell that was even more diabolical than the underground pit. It was the wall oubliette, built directly into the thick curtain walls of the upper castle apartments, right beside the great banquet halls. The placement was a deliberate act of psychological torture. The stone walls of a medieval castle are incredibly thick, often 10 to 15 feet of solid rubble and mortar. A cell carved into the middle of this masonry acted like a one-way acoustic valve. The prisoner inside could hear everything happening in the world of the living. You could hear the muffled thumping of horse hooves in the courtyard below. You could hear the high, sweet notes of a minstrel's lute during a feast. You could hear the laughter of the Lord's children playing in the corridor just 6 inches from your face. But nobody could hear you. The stone absorbed your screams. Your frantic pounding on the mortar left nothing but bloody smudges on the rock and a faint, dull thud that the guards outside mistook for the settling of the masonry or the scratching of mice behind the woodwork. You were 3 feet away from a hot roast mallard and a goblet of spiced wine, yet you were closer to death than a man buried in a graveyard. You were a ghost who hadn't had the decency to die yet. You were completely surrounded by life, yet you were entirely erased from it. You could hear the world continuing to spin, celebrating its victories and mourning its dead, while you sat in a dark slit of stone, your skin turning yellow from lack of sun, realizing that your family had already stopped praying for your release and had begun praying for your soul. When the psychological erasure fails to break your spirit completely, the system turns to its most reliable physical ally, the slow restriction of fuel. In the medieval ledger, starvation was never viewed as a natural consequence of neglect. It was handled as an active administrative instrument, calibrated with the same precision a pharmacist uses to measure out drops of hemlock. The state did not provide a food ration. There was no standard daily allowance of grain or water for the inmates of a castle vault. If you ate, it was because someone outside the walls paid the jailer for the specific weight of the flour that went into your loaf. This practice reached its most grotesque legal manifestation in the English tradition known as peine forte et dure, which translates literally to hard and forceful punishment. This was not a sentence carried out after a trial. This was a technique used to force a prisoner to stand trial in the first place. Under medieval law, if an accused man refused to plead guilty or not guilty before the magistrate, the court could not proceed. If he died without entering a plea, his property could not be legally confiscated by the crown or the local bishop. His land would pass to his children, keeping his family from starving in the ditches. To break this legal stalemate, the jailer would lead the prisoner back down to the stone floor of the press room. The man would be stripped naked and stretched out on his back, his arms and legs bound to iron rings set deep into the limestone. A heavy oak door or a weighted wooden platform would then be lowered onto his chest. Then the stones would arrive. On the first day, the assistants would place 3 heavy iron weights onto the board. The prisoner's ribs would groan under the initial pressure, the breath forced out of his lungs in short, ragged gasps. He would be given 3 morsels of the worst barley bread available, bread made from the sweepings of the mill floor, mixed with grit and chaff. On the second day, more stones were added, and he would be given 3 sips of stagnant water drawn from the castle ditch, water that sat green and oily in the bucket. The choice was a masterpiece of legal malice. If the prisoner gave in and pleaded, he would be hanged within 24 hours, and his children would be left penniless. If he held his breath, remained silent, and allowed the stones to slowly crush his chest over 3 or 4 days until his ribs punctured his lungs, he died an innocent man in the eyes of the property laws. His family kept the farm. It was a transaction where a father traded the structural integrity of his own skeleton to purchase the survival of his sons. But for the ordinary debtor or petty thief, who was not subject to the press, starvation was more casual, though no less lethal. It was an itemized expense. The records from the ancient Châtelet prison in Paris reveal a system where jailers regularly served bread that was deliberately stretched with chalk dust, ground bean husks, and dried sawdust to save on the cost of flour. This mixture did not sustain life. It irritated the lining of the stomach, producing an agonizing, watery dysentery that swept through the communal cells like a fire through dry thatch. Within 2 weeks, a healthy man's muscles would dissolve. his eyes sinking back into his skull until he looked like a parchment sheet stretched over a wire frame. And the ultimate irony of this system was that when a prisoner finally died of this induced wasting, the jailer did not simply throw the body into a ditch and close the book. He would send a final, itemized invoice to the dead man's widow. She would be charged for the 3 weeks of foul water her husband drank, she would be charged for the straw that absorbed his final sweat, and she would be charged a specific fee for the removal of the iron shackles from his ankles, so that those same irons could be rented to the next man brought down the stairs. The final stage of the dungeon's machinery is not physical destruction. It is the total submission of the human will. Once your body has been softened by the cold of the forgotten chamber, your resources drained by the protection racket of Garnish, and your stomach shrunk by the calculated invoices of starvation, you are ready for the interrogation room. Most people imagine this room as a chaotic theater of screams, red-hot iron pokers, and blood-spattered walls. But the men who ran the castle dungeons were professionals. They were bureaucrats of agony. They understood that the physical application of pain is a messy, inefficient business that often kills the subject before they can provide useful data. Therefore, they developed a formal legal and psychological protocol known in the ancient texts as the presentation of the question. The process begins in the middle of the night, when your psychological defenses are at their lowest ebb. The heavy iron keys rattle in the oak door. 2 guards in leather jerkins lift you by your armpits. Your feet, swollen from scurvy and numbed by the wet stone, drag along the corridor floor as they carry you up a winding flight of narrow stairs. You do not go toward the light. You go deeper into the heart of the masonry, into a room with no windows and walls so thick that the sound of a human throat tearing itself open cannot penetrate the mortar. When you enter, the room is quiet. A single candle burns on a trestle table where a clerk sits with an open inkwell and a clean sheet of vellum. In the center of the room stands the executioner. He does not yell. He does not threaten you. He wears a hood of black wool that completely obscures his features, transforming him from a man into an anonymous agent of the state. He leads you by the hand, almost gently, toward the devices. First, he shows you the thumbscrew. He turns the iron crank in front of your eyes, letting you hear the dry shriep of the threaded screw moving through the iron plate. He points to the sharp, triangular studs on the interior metal. He explains, in a flat, conversational tone, how those studs will press into the soft tissue beneath your fingernail, splitting the nail vertically before the main plate begins to flatten the distal phalanx, the bone at the very tip of your thumb. He tells you that it takes roughly 45 minutes of turning to turn the bone into fine gravel, and that you will feel every individual click of the metal thread. Next, he walks you over to the rack. He touches the thick oak rollers, worn smooth by the friction of hemp ropes and human joint. He describes how the tension will be applied to your wrists and ankles. He tells you that at the 3rd turn of the capstan, your shoulder blades will slip out of their sockets with a dull, wet pop. At the 4th turn, the ligaments in your hips will tear. He notes, with clinical indifference, that the human body can be stretched up to 5 inches before the skin itself begins to tear open along the flank. Then, he tells the guards to take you back to your cell. This is the peak of the psychological trap. You have not been touched. Not a single hair on your head has been harmed. But as the iron door slams shut again, you are no longer alone in the dark. You are trapped in a room with your own imagination. For the next 48 hours, every time you close your eyes, you see the black thread of the thumbscrew turning. Every time you hear a sound, you think it is the click of the rack's wooden gears. The executioner has planted the seeds of pain in your mind, and your own brain will cultivate those seeds into absolute terror. The records show that the confession rate after the presentation of the question was significantly higher than the rate after actual physical torture. The mind, when given a clear, detailed blueprint of its own destruction, will do anything to avoid that reality. You will confess to crimes you never committed. You will sign a document stating that you poisoned wells you have never seen, that you spoke with demons whose names you cannot pronounce, and that you stole gold from noblemen who do not exist. You will sign anything because the system has completed its work. It has broken your body, it has emptied your pockets, it has erased your name from the world above, and finally, it has rewritten your mind. When you are finally led out to the gallows or the chopping block, you are not a man being executed for a crime. You are simply the empty husk of an organism that the castle has finished chewing. The invoice is settled. The ledger is closed. The scratch marks on the wall remain, waiting for the next name to be written in the dark. If you enjoy dark, untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.